Okay, we left off with food, popular food culture. If you want to pause it and take notes on this, it talks about why relatively um, little wine is consumed in or little alcohol is consumed in Utah, and that's going back to page 120. Okay, is that 120? Where's my wine? Yeah, that's 120. A couple of things I highlighted here. That I thought were interesting is, why people produce the kind of wine that they produce. It says the climate, okay, the environmental factors are climate, topography, and soil. And clearly, I don't know anything about growing wine, um, but there are some particulars as to why certain wines taste a certain way that they do, and it's because of the climate they come from. But they also mention the cultural factors, and one of the things I do know about studying history is that one reason why it mentions that wine, the social custom, and this is on page 121 under wine production cultural factors, if you want to find that. The social custom of wine production in much of France and Italy extends back at least to the Roman Empire. Well, the Roman Empire, when you think about how water and the lack of sanitation for water, wine, because it was fermented and it was processed, was actually safer to drink in many cases than it was to drink water. It's one of the reasons why wine was even drunk in the first place. It wasn't to get drunk, it wasn't to do anything else. It was simply because it was better tasting and safer and more sanitary than water that wasn't processed. Um, but it says it declined after the fall of the Roman Empire. Many vineyards were destroyed, but it was also religious. Monasteries preserved the winemaking tradition in medieval Europe for both sustenance, okay, so the fact just to drink it, and for ritual. And then the consumption has become extremely popular again in Europe. And the reason why it became popular in the Western Hemisphere is because we were colonized by the Europeans. Okay. And then now it's more because of leisure and can you afford to buy it than it is based on religious organizations that do it. It's owned by private people and corporations. And then it talks about, again, another cultural factor is religion. Okay. Hindus and Muslims in particular avoid alcoholic beverages, thus, wine production is limited in the Middle East with the exception of Jerusalem. Sorry, not Jerusalem, but Israel. And Southern Asia primarily because of cultural values, mainly religion. Now, going on to housing, this is, again, I find all of this stuff really fascinating. Hello. Um, it talks about why houses were built and the influences of folk housing. One of the things I highlighted here was the very first thing where it says on 122, it says French geographer Jean Brunes, a major contributor to the cultural landscape tradition, viewed the house as being among the essential facts of human geography. And then Fred Kniffen considered the house to be a good reflection of cultural heritage, current fashion, functional needs, and the impact of environment. So you can read through, and I encourage you to read through the where the wood and the brick houses are. But what I found interesting was the differences in um, northern and western China. In Figure 423, it talks about um, and shows that down here, all used similar building materials, including adobe and timber from desert poplar trees, but they still had distinct designs in each location attributed to your local cultural preference. Okay, so it shows you the different types of houses that you would find in Kashgar, Duang, I'm going to say it wrong, Turpan, and Yinshuan. Okay, and those are all in northern and western China, more rural areas, but they show you the difference in what your houses would look like, even though they're using the same kind of materials. Okay, and I also find it interesting that why people do the things they do, in the sense that the sacred spaces in houses, and so I'm really kind of curious. As to if any of you guys have particular walls that are considered sacred or maybe an evil spirit, or do you face, like in my house, my father always sat at the head actually, my mother always sat at the head of the table, to be honest, and my father sat right next to her. But that was just a tradition that we did in our family. She was the one that cooked. She was the one that did all the whatever, and it was just something we did. And there's no sacredness to it except it was tradition in our house. And then my brothers and I would fight over who was sitting where at the rest of the table. Um, so my question to you guys is there any kind of, it mentions in Madagascar, the main door is on the west, considered the most important direction, and the northeastern corner is the most sacred. So because we are such a diverse group of kiddos, I'd be interested to find out, if there's anything like that that's like that in your house. We've already talked about people taking off shoes and why that's important. So again, our cultural differences are really kind of unique in the setting here at Flower Mound. So that's just something really interesting to talk about. And then it goes on to mention the eastern wall of the house is sacred in Fiji, and all directions except south have significance in Madagascar. It gives you the in Laos and Thailand the differences in where houses are put, where their doors are facing. And so again, just some interesting rules, regulations, however you want to look at it, reasons for why people are facing houses are faced the way they are. The other thing that it mentions again on page 124 is the U.S. and how different we are. The style of pioneer homes reflected whatever upscale style was prevailing at the place on the East Coast from which they migrated. So if you came from the East Coast and you were moving out west with your 160 acres and you were building a log cabin, a lot of times that had to do with what part of the East Coast you were from and what prevailing pattern of style of house was going on there. He also identified 3 major hearths or nodes for folk housing: the Middle Atlantic, the Lower Chesapeake, and the New England. And I'm going to go find some better examples of this because your book doesn't really have an example of what those houses would look like. It describes them, but I'm more of a visual person. But it does show on page 125 the difference in houses, okay? And we'll talk more in depth in class on that because I've got a better PowerPoint that talks about that. And there's always a chance that you would have that on a test, on an AP exam. What kind of house is this and what part of the U.S. would it come from? So it is important to know the Middle Atlantic, Lower Chesapeake, Tidewater, and New England style houses. So go ahead and look at the documenting house types through fieldwork piece that they have on figure 427, regional differences, and look at that. And it talks about where these diffused to and why they look so different. If you've been up in New England, you know that there's definitely a different. And they also talk about the fact that World War II, and I highlighted that on page 124, says houses built in the United States since mid-20th century display popular cultural influences, and then the degree of regional distinctiveness in housing styles has diminished because of the rapid communication. It happens so quickly now that it's not necessarily, and the biggest piece that they mention here is the fact that because so many neighborhoods after World War II, especially, were started to be built by construction companies in mass quantities, it kind of diminished the distinctiveness of house. Okay, and that's what it mentions. It says, which extended in 1994, most U.S. houses were built in a modern style, and since the 1960s, styles that architects call neo-eclectic have predominated. But when houses are mass-produced by construction companies, you'll see model homes saying there's 4 or 5 examples to go by, and every house in that neighborhood is going to be one of those 4 or 5 styles that they have available. Bigger bathrooms, smaller bathrooms, those kind of things. So, at any rate, so that's the end of key issue 2. And you can look at this and pause and take note of that. And again, just notes on the PowerPoint. Oh, and now we're going to move on to key issue 3 in the next video.